Well, folks, thanks for tuning in today again as we wrap up the week and we're finishing our last day here in Oklahoma after meetings in Oklahoma City and in the capital, meeting with business people and political movements. It's been a great time. Wonderful people here in the state of Oklahoma, friendly, feel strongly about what they believe, willing to engage and talk, and it's been a great time. So let's jump right into it. Well, I'll tell you what's interesting. There's been a lot in the news. As you know, it's been a lot of focus relative to President Trump and also President Xi over there in China and Trump's visit. And just to kind of reflect on the fact that news is always seen through the eye of the beholder. So some major news stations, international news stations, will say, well, Trump scored big. He got Xi to say that, yeah, Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. He got Xi to say that, China is going to help to keep open the Straits of Hormuz. And then you listen to other networks and they say, man, not so much. Trump came away with very little. And even when we talk about the situation relative to Taiwan. So at best, it looks like a bit of a saw-off, but markets are seeming to indicate that the message that Xi was getting is that they should be at least carefully supporting U.S. relative to Iran ever getting a nuclear bomb. We'll see how that works out. Then on the big question about Taiwan, and did they raise the issue? Well, first of all, when you go into, I'm somewhat familiar having met with presidents, including the president of China. When you go into meetings like this and they're closed door, supposedly, you make sure you cover a wide range of topics, that you at least mention them, and you don't have to say that you got agreement. And then when the reporters say, did you talk about this? You can talk about that. You can say, yes, indeed, you did. So they did. There was some discussion about Taiwan. I pointed that out yesterday, and I see news outlets today jumping on what I was saying yesterday, that President Xi would say some things that are kind of neutral, but then his foreign minister, and her name is Mao, she came out very strongly relative to the Taiwan issue. Then I'm getting some commentary, some people saying, hey, can you give us a quick reminder historically, what is with Taiwan? What's that all about, Taiwan and China? Well, you have to go back to about 1910, that's quite a while ago, when the last dynasty in China, dynasties were like monarchies in Europe, so they were really like kingdoms, and that was China's history for hundreds, if not a few thousand years. And the last dynasty, the Qin dynasty, Q-U-I-N, ended in 1910, and that's when you had the movement, really a communist movement that was starting up, and fueled by ideas that were coming out of communism, out of Europe, Karl Marx and others. And so you had two forces, two leading people. One was Mao Zedong, and he became known as Chairman Mao. He led the communist side of the new uprising after throwing out the dynasties. And the other was Chiang Kai-shek, and he led what was called the nationalist side. So they weren't as communist, but they did want a China-only policy. That war actually that internal rebellion and revolution carried on for decades. It was kind of interrupted at the Second World War, and then, of course, earlier than that, Japan invading parts of China. And things really came to a head as Chairman Mao's forces really became predominant and powerful. So Chiang Kai-shek, who was head of the nationalist movement, with about 2 million of his followers, they fled China and went over to the island of Taiwan. And from Taiwan, they said, we're the real people of China. And the people on the mainland, of course, a lot more of them, about 100 million as opposed to 2 million in Taiwan, they said, no, it's us. And mainland or communist forces have always said, Taiwan actually belongs to us. They've always said, you know what, Taiwan, we're coming to get you one day, peacefully or otherwise. What we've seen since 1949, Taiwan adopting more, North American or even European style. They allowed for freedom of markets, freedom of enterprise, freedom of religion, a much freer, less communist lockdown state. And you see Taiwan becoming much more, on a per-person basis, much more prosperous than China, and not having many of the things that accompany communism. So that's basically how it rolls out and continues to this day. And that's why Taiwan continues to look to the U.S. and says, look, if mainland China comes to conquer us, are you going to help us? And the U.S. has always supplied significant weaponry to Taiwan. That's been a deterrent to China. And so that kind of Cold War continues. And that's why even at these discussions, Chairman Xi gets his foreign affairs minister, and as I said, her name is Mao, to come out saying really tough things that U.S. should back away from Taiwan or there's going to be problems. So we have to take all of these in kind of a mixed view and see what is what and how things are going to evolve. Well, I'll tell you what, this weekend is going to be a very interesting weekend because what you're going to be seeing in the U.S. and Canada to a degree and around the world are huge protests, and it's called the Nakba or Nakba 78 protest. Now, Nakba refers to, this is the word used by the Arab or Muslim community in 1948 when the UN declared that Israel did have the right to exist as a Jewish state. 5 Arab countries that surrounded Israel right in 1948 said, we don't accept what the United Nations is saying. We are going to destroy Israel. And so those 5 nations sent the word out very clearly, prepare for war, Israel. At that time, about 400,000 Muslim Arabs who were living in Israel, they bailed out. They started to leave. They said there's going to be a war. Jews are going to get massacred. Let's get out of the way. Let the massacre happen. And one thing that is not reported on widely, at the same time, Muslim nations around Israel were kicking Jews out who had lived for hundreds of years in those nations. So Israel, in a very short period of time in 1948, had to absorb 1948 and forward, had to absorb about 1 million new immigrants who were Jewish being kicked out of Muslim states, and over 400,000 Muslims left Israel. And the Nakba refers to that word. It means catastrophe, the great catastrophe. This is what, till this day, Muslim states refer to as the 1948 referral, Israel being a state, and all those Muslims leaving, becoming largely the Palestinian component. And they've pledged that they are going to get back, that they're going to take over Israel. So what's happening now in the 78, because it's called Nakba 78, that they say that Israel actually has 78% of territory that really belongs to the Palestinian people. That's why it's called Nakba 78. You're going to see huge demonstrations. There's concerns that it's going to get violent around the world. You're going to see them in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Australia. You're going to see it in Canada. You're going to see it in the UK as there's this unified sort of May 14, 1948 remembrance of the Nakba, and we're going to watch that carefully. There's been a lot of reporting on who funds this, and very interesting when you follow when you follow the money, because you may have heard of a gentleman by the name of the person who owns the Singham network. His name is Singham, and he developed high quality tech capabilities and an entire tech network, which he sold in 2018 for billions of dollars. And he's very significantly tied to China. He went and spent some time over in Shanghai, lived there for a number of years. He says he's not a Chinese agent, but he's a billionaire because of the sale of his Singham network, and it's called ThoughtWorks is the name of that. And he actually physically married. If you've heard of something called, so you got Neville Roy Singham is the guy who owned ThoughtWorks, sells it all, becomes billionaire financer of left-wing causes around the world. And he marries Jody Evans. Jody Evans, if you've heard of Code Pink, that's her organization. She's been a strong left-leaning leader for years. They marry up, and together they fund many, many leftist causes, and a lot of their funding goes to support even movements that are going to be happening this weekend, like Nakba 78. So that's where you see these clashes between people who get very wealthy wind up supporting the causes that they most closely ascribe to, and that's the funding reality. So you see a lot of this, why we're keeping an eye on what's going to be happening this weekend, with concerns that Nakba 78 rallies are going to be violent, especially related to anti-Semitic and related to the Jewish people. Well, take a look just across the water from Florida, and you see Cuba, which has lost a lot of its oil supply ever since the U.S. clamped down on Venezuela and has been intercepting the oil there. And really, the thought is that Trump is realizing that if you can starve out these regimes, the leaders of these regimes, whether you're talking about Cuba, whether you're talking about Iran, that the people will have a chance to rise up. They have literally run out of diesel, run out of energy and oil in Cuba. And the interesting thing that media isn't really reporting, the U.S. has said, look, we are willing to help you. They've said to Cuba, the government, we're willing to help you, $100 million, and we'll let the oil start flowing. All we want you to do is open up the internet for your people, because, of course, Cuba, being a communist government, does not allow their people to have free information from around the world. And they know that if the government there knows that once people get information about how terrible their own communist government is and how well people are doing in non-communist countries, things will collapse. But the regime in Cuba is saying, no, we don't want the American help. We don't want the money. We don't want the oil. We'd rather starve our people than let them know the truth. So we're going to see how that particular battle wars and continues on. But Cuba in a very tough situation right now, even in terms of being able to feed and heat or cool, depending if it's air conditioning you want, their own people. Well, in Canada, we've heard a lot, I've talked a lot here about Bill C-9, which will take away the right even of church ministers to read certain passages of the Bible. Talk about communism, it's probably the worst legislation in the free democratic world. And along with that is another bill called Bill C-22, and this one, most of the big tech firms are trying to warn Canadians, saying what the government is putting there is it's forcing your tech company, wherever you do your search engines and where you store all your information and the things you look at, are going to be made forced to make the information about you more readily and quickly available to the government. And some of the major tech companies are trying to get the attention of Canadians, saying we're being forced to do this. Just know that it's going to be very easy for your government to cover everything and find out everything from your search engines to what you look at to who you talk to. So we're going to see that bill continue to rage. But the combination of Bill C-22 and Bill C-9 on religious freedoms is starting to alarm people in Canada. Well, just last night you saw Drake. They're saying he froze the CN Tower. Actually, what he did, if you've got the money, you can pay the CN Tower millions of dollars and fly your colors right up the tower. So he iced it. He said he's covered it. He froze the tower. He's promoting his new album, and it's an amazing way. It's brilliant, actually, because it might cost millions to have the CN Tower all one color, but the billions of dollars of free coverage you get from around the world in doing that is pretty significant. So let's see how his new album is going to work. His new album is called Iceman. He's been promoting it for a while, and let's see how successful that gets. Well, in Canada, our U.S. friends even are aware there's a huge coffee and donut chain called Tim Hortons, and people in Canada treat Tim Hortons like it's a national emblem, a national religious site almost, in terms of where we go to get our coffee and donuts. And Dunkin' Donuts has announced they're coming back. The company that brought Dunkin' Donuts in several years ago and closed up shop in Canada because they were having internal problems. There's been an announcement, ice in your coffee. Well, Dunkin' Donuts, are they going to be icing Tim Hortons? A lot of feeling that Canadians will not abandon Tim Hortons. Dunkin' Donuts coming. Let's see what happens. Sometimes people watch these more than they watch situations between China and the U.S., for instance. Well, in Canada, and friends in the United States would know this too, they, especially in my generation, have heard of Buffy St. Marie, a very, very famous singer and folk singer in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And she got into a lot of trouble 10 or so years ago. She had a number of her honors and rewards taken away because of the fact it was found out she was not telling the truth. She, in fact, was not Indigenous, and it was actually the Canadian press that exposed that. She's lost another award now, another one being taken away from her because pretty well every award she's ever gotten continues to be stripped away because she did not tell the truth. She is not, in fact, Indigenous, but was born, and birth records show her coming from Massachusetts. So I still like her music, many people do, but one more award stripped from Buffy St. Marie. There's a story, a very tragic and a heartbreaking story about an 11-year-old boy just being killed recently in Edmonton, attacked by dogs. And it's all coming out in courtroom stuff that's emerging. And these particular dogs is now coming out in the court files. They had a number of cases where they had severely attacked other people, put an elderly woman in hospital, had attacked neighbors. And, you know, I get really upset with this. What is with people worshiping their dogs so much that they won't have them euthanized after they've been known to have attacked people? And in this case, the tragic case that happened some time ago and is now in court with an 11-year-old boy killed by dogs. You know, in my many years of running, I've been a runner for decades. I've been attacked by dogs a number of times, and the response from the dog owner is always the same. Oh, our little poopsie dog would never, I've never seen him be mean to people. She's never like that. This has never happened. Dog owners, many of them are responsible. I would say most are responsible. But to those of you who are irresponsible, if your dogs have a record of attacking people, you're going to be held responsible. And this person who owned these dogs is facing manslaughter charges. It really, I don't know, I just really get irritated. I love dogs. We had dogs growing up. But loving dogs is one thing. Dog worship is another. And very concerning what happens here. Well, on a positive front, Vancouver Canucks had wound up last place in the NHL, and they just announced yesterday the Sedin twins are coming back. Daniel and Henrik Sedin are being appointed as co-presidents of the Vancouver Canucks, and we're going to see if that's going to result in a turnaround for them. Well, interesting. You heard it first here. We were talking the last few days about beef prices and what we think is going to influence those. Beef prices continue to go up in the U.S. and in Canada. We talked about the fact it was largely to do with drought over the last few years and the shrinking of the herd nationally. And, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, where all the chemicals come for fertilizer, has been a problem. And finally, we've seen mainstream media reporting on what we were talking about a few days ago, and they're agreeing with us. Folks, meat prices are going to stay high for 2 to 3 years is the prediction, because it's going to take that long for the herds to recover. And the fact, we'll say this again, many people who had gone off beef because they were told that it was killing them, beef is unhealthy, and of course cow flatulence or cow farts were destroying the environment. A lot of that has been turned back now and refuted by the science, so more and more people getting back on the beef menu. And so these are, so just brace yourselves and lock down for it. Beef prices not coming down soon. In a very rare move, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the country of Israel is actually suing the New York Times, suing the entire newspaper, because the New York Times have been trotting out the most outrageous stories about Israeli soldiers and Israeli individuals, especially those in the so-called settlements, planned widespread sexual violence that being accused of by the IDF, soldiers and citizens roaming through Arab areas, raping children, raping women, even getting into animal, let's just call it atrocities. It's been outrageous. What they've been saying is all lies, packs of lies, just like the genocide lies that kick around. And so in a very rare move, you have a country, Israel, suing the New York Times. The New York Times is going to have to prove what they've been saying, and we're going to watch that case with interest. Well, another case of interest that's coming up in Canada right now, you got a grade 10 student. His name is Ishan Akria. I'm not sure what ethnic designation that is, but he's a grade 10 student. And what happened in his school, in his area, in the school in Waterloo, just a couple of years ago, they changed the name. It was called, it was named after a Canadian prime minister, a founding prime minister, and the school decided that was, racist and terrible to name a school after a prime minister that was involved and living at the time of the so-called residential crisis, residential school situation. So they changed the name. Well, this student now has gone and investigated. He's found it was $175,000 was spent to change the name of this school, public school in Waterloo. And he's saying, we need money for education. We don't have enough money. Our teachers are all saying we need more money. And here the school board spent $175,000. So he's getting, CTV News is covering this, and the grade 10 student getting a lot of coverage on what he says is really a dumb thing that never should have happened. Sir John A. Macdonald Secondary School should never have had its name changed. We'll see where that goes. So students becoming more activist all the time. Interesting to see that continue to move along. We'll see where it goes. Well, folks, we like to talk about Gen Z a lot and give you some of the latest trends there. But I'm giving a heads up to parents. Generation Alpha, Gen Alpha, that's basically, you would call that sort of 8 to 12-year-olds are increasingly actually seen as the real, some of the real opinion makers. And recent survey of parents on Gen Alpha, 85% of Gen Alpha get an allowance. And I think they should if they're doing chores. Don't give kids free money, but if they're doing chores, pay them. And 76% of parents are paying for chores. 65% of parents at Gen Alpha are paying their kids for good behavior, just to behave well. We didn't get paid for that when we were kids. We were expected to behave, so we had to be, as they say, good for nothing. We were good for nothing. But they're really becoming an economic force. And Gen Alpha, these kids, their parents are admitting that 71% of their parents are making consumer choices and changing their consumer choices based on what their kids are saying. They're 8 to 12-year-old kids. Gen Alpha having a huge influence, and Gen Alpha being really influenced by influencers. That's why these influencers on the internet get so much money, because now if you can get the 8 to 12-year-olds clamoring to their parents saying, buy this or buy that, 54% of the parents surveyed say they pay special attention to what their Gen Alpha kids are saying. And we like to give you a new word every now and then, or almost daily. And this is coming from Gen Alpha. The new words, so-called new words, usually we give from Gen Z, Gen Z, skibbity or skibbity. This comes from parents or grandparents. You may not have heard of this. It was a YouTube series. I think it might even be still out there. A lot of kids still watching. And it's called Skibbity Toilet. I won't even get into what it's all about, but it was very popular among young kids on YouTube. And so the word skibbity, it means actually weird or chaotic or random. So if you want to impress your Gen Alpha 8 to 12-year-olds, you see something that's a little weird, you say, whoa, that is so skibbity. And they're going to say, wow, how did my folks learn that? Well, yesterday we talked about, in terms of what we hear, we like to report on some of the developments in the faith-based world. And we talked about a famous couple, athletes were praying for healing. They never got it. The player, in fact, lost his position in the Major League Baseball. But it talked about how it's not always, faith is strengthened sometimes by going through trials. And so Amy Grant's album that has been out recently, it's called The Me That Remains, talks a lot about the terrible bicycle accident she had a few years ago, in which she had severe brain damage and just devastated even her ability to think clearly and to sing. And talks about her faith journey. And again, it's not one of, often you hear about the remarkable turnaround miracle, but it's a recounting how faith can get you through tough times. So we're hearing both kind of stories emerging in mainstream media there. And bottom line is faith gets people through, especially if you're talking about faith that is biblically based, faith in God, faith in Christ. Keep those things in mind. Let me know what you think. Thanks for the feedback. Talk to you tomorrow.